The wedding feast had drawn nearly the entire town. Tables lined with silver plates, candles flickering against the wide evening sky, laughter echoing louder than the crack of a rifle. It was meant to be a celebration, but for the struggling rancher sitting at the end of the long table, it felt more like a trial. His clothes were worn, his hands calloused, and though he had worked harder than most men in that room, he was treated like an uninvited guest at his own people's feast. The rich men smirked behind polished glasses, their wives whispering about how far he had fallen. And yet, he remained silent, his dignity the only thing he refused to sell. Every jest, every quiet insult, was a dagger cloaked in laughter. They mocked the way he ate, the way he held his fork as if it were a tool from the stables rather than the fine silver laid before him. Someone even joked that the dust on his boots had more stories than the land he owned. But what none of them understood was that this man, this worn, tired rancher, had weathered droughts, debts, and the kind of loneliness that would have broken them all. The pain in his silence wasn't weakness. It was restraint, the kind only a man who has lost everything but pride can know. The feast continued, the music growing louder, the laughter crueler. His shoulders stiffened, his jaw clenched, but he said nothing. He had fought storms, not men, and his pride would not allow him to trade dignity for defiance. Still, the sting of humiliation burned deep, the weight of their mockery pressing harder than the debts he carried. He looked down at his plate, not in shame, but to keep the fire in his chest from showing through his eyes. Because in the West, a man's silence could mean many things, but this time, it was a storm waiting for the right wind. Then, as the jeers rose again, a shadow moved at the edge of the feast. The air shifted. Conversations faltered. A figure, tall, broad, and unmistakable, stepped forward from beyond the firelight. The giant Comanche, known across the frontier for his strength and solitude, had come uninvited. His presence alone was enough to silence the laughter that had filled the night. He said nothing at first, his gaze sweeping across the table like a storm rolling over the plains. The rancher raised his head slowly, eyes meeting the warriors, unsure what this moment meant. And then, with a calmness that cut sharper than any blade, the Comanche spoke. "A man's worth," he said, his voice low and steady, "isn't measured by his boots or his gold, but by what he stands through." The words hung in the air, heavy and sacred. The laughter died completely, and even the proudest men turned pale. In that moment, beneath the glow of the fire and the hush of the night, the rancher felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not pity, not pride, but respect. And sometimes in the Old West, that was worth more than land, gold, or any feast ever laid before man. The night after the feast, the rancher couldn't sleep. The echo of laughter still lingered in his mind like the wind scraping through dry grass. Every mocking glance, every whispered insult from that long table, weighed on him heavier than any debt he had ever owed. He sat alone by the corral, his rough hands gripping the wood, staring at the stars that refused to move. The humiliation had burned deep, not because they had mocked his poverty, but because they had mocked his dignity, the one thing he had left untouched by struggle. But as the dawn crept over the land, the rancher's thoughts turned not to anger, but to the strange moment that had silenced the entire feast. The memory of the giant Comanche's voice, deep and steady, still echoed in his heart. A man's worth isn't measured by his boots or his gold, but by what he stands through. Those words struck something in him that even years of hardship couldn't break. It wasn't pity that the warrior had shown him. It was respect, and in the West, respect was rarer than rain. The town woke that morning in whispers. Some couldn't believe the Comanche had stepped into a white man celebration. Others spoke of the way he had stood, calm, unflinching, his presence alone commanding the kind of silence even the wealthy couldn't buy. For many, it was the first time they saw that strength wasn't measured by land or wealth, but by honor. Yet for the rancher, it was more personal. It was as if someone had seen through the dust and debt, straight into the man he once was, and reminded him that worth was not something granted by others, but carried within. Later that day, the rancher returned to his fields. His sons, who had seen their father mocked and shamed, watched him in silence. They expected bitterness, perhaps anger, but instead they saw calm. He worked slowly, methodically, every motion a reminder that pride doesn't need noise to be real. The Comanche's words had not only restored his confidence, they had reignited his purpose. From that day on, the rancher worked the land not to prove himself to others, but to honor the respect he had been shown. The people of the town went on with their lives, but the story of that night began to grow. Around every fire and every saloon, they spoke of the moment the laughter died at the Comanche's arrival, the moment pride met humility, and dignity was defended by a man of few words but immeasurable presence. And somewhere between those retellings, the struggling rancher began to find his place again, not as a man of wealth or power, but as one who stood quietly on the side of honor. Days passed, and though the rancher spoke little of that night, the change in him was visible. The same men who had mocked him now avoided his gaze. They didn't fear him. They feared what he reminded them of. In the West, reputation was everything, but that night had proved something else mattered far more: character. The Comanche's words had stripped away the false layers of pride from the rich and reminded everyone that respect, once earned, could humble even the mightiest. The rancher's farm, though still struggling, began to draw quiet admiration. People who once turned away now nodded as they passed, tipping their hats with a kind of cautious respect. They saw how he carried himself, with the quiet grace of a man who didn't need to shout to be heard. And though he never said it out loud, every furrow he plowed, every seed he planted, felt like a tribute to the man who had stood for him when no one else would. But word of the event had traveled farther than the town. Weeks later, a group of riders arrived, men of wealth and influence, eager to meet the Comanche who had dared to challenge their own kind. They wanted to confront him, to reassert their pride. When they found the rancher instead, they laughed again. "Still letting that savage fight your battles?" One sneered. The rancher didn't answer. He simply kept working, the dirt clinging to his boots as if the land itself stood beside him. What they didn't expect was the sound of hooves in the distance. The riders turned as the giant Comanche appeared again on the ridge, his shadow cast long across the sunlit earth. He didn't raise his weapon, nor did he shout. His silence was enough. The men, who had arrived with arrogance, now felt the same weight the rancher once had, the silent judgment of someone who needed no wealth to command respect. One by one, they turned their horses and rode away. The rancher looked up at the Comanche, their eyes meeting once more. No words were exchanged, because none were needed. In that glance was a truth that stretched far beyond pride or poverty, that some men are measured not by what they own or say, but by the way they carry themselves when others choose cruelty. The Comanche turned his horse and disappeared beyond the hills, leaving behind not just the echo of his presence, but the seed of something greater, a lesson the town and the rancher would never forget. As spring turned the hard soil soft again, the rancher found himself working with a strength that surprised even him. His debts were still there, his land still humble, but something inside him had shifted. The burden that had once been his back now seemed lighter, not because his life had become easier, but because his heart had learned to carry it differently. The Comanche's words had become like a prayer, whispered silently through every sunrise. A man's worth is what he stands through. The town had not forgotten the wedding feast either. The story became a quiet legend, told by men who once mocked him, and repeated by those who wished they had shown the same restraint. They spoke of how the Comanche had stood not for blood or kinship, but for justice. Some said the rancher didn't deserve such a defense. Others argued that the defense itself proved he did. Whatever the truth, the tale grew, like all good stories do, shaping the way people looked at honor and silence in a world where words were cheap. The rancher's sons noticed the change most of all. Their father, once weary and worn, now moved with quiet confidence. He didn't chase wealth, nor did he speak against those who had wronged him. Instead, he worked his land as if it were sacred, each seed planted with purpose. They began to follow his example, not because he commanded them, but because they finally saw the kind of man he was. In his silence, there was wisdom. In his labor, there was pride. One afternoon, as the rancher rode to town for supplies, he saw one of the men who had mocked him at the feast struggling to pull a wagon from the mud. Without hesitation, he dismounted and helped. The man avoided his eyes, ashamed, but the rancher said nothing. Together, They freed the wagon, and as he turned to leave, the man finally spoke, his voice quiet and broken. "I was wrong," he said. The rancher tipped his hat, nodded once, and walked away. Forgiveness, he believed, was better shown than spoken. That night, as he sat by the fire, the rancher looked up at the stars, the same ones that had watched him through hardship, humiliation, and redemption. For the first time in years, he didn't feel small beneath them. He felt part of something larger, something unspoken. In a world where pride often broke men, humility had made him stronger. And somewhere out there, beyond the hills, he knew the giant Comanche rode under the same sky, guided by the same unspoken truth. Weeks later, a drought began to grip the land. Rivers thinned, grass turned brittle, and temperatures across the valley began to rise. The wealthy ranchers who had once mocked the struggling man now found themselves facing the same fear he had lived with for years, the fear of loss. But the rancher, hardened by countless seasons of failure, faced it differently. Where others cursed the sky, he worked quietly, rationing water, tending his cattle with care. He knew that survival in the West wasn't about strength alone. It was about endurance, patience, and faith. One morning, as the sun burned red over the horizon, a group of riders appeared on the rancher's land. It was the same men from the feast, their fine clothes now stained with dust, their horses thin from thirst. They asked for help, water, feed, anything he could spare. For a moment, the rancher stood still, his face unreadable. His sons watched, expecting him to turn them away, to repay humiliation with pride. But instead, he nodded slowly. "Take what you need," he said. "The land gives to all who work it." The men were stunned. One removed his hat, shame clouding his eyes. "After what we did," he began, but the rancher raised his hand, silencing him. "The past feeds no one," he said. "Only what we do now matters." His words carried the same quiet strength the Comanche once spoke with. And in that moment, they realized that the man they had mocked had become the very embodiment of the code they had forgotten. Word of his generosity spread quickly. The town that had once ridiculed him now saw him as something rare, a man whose dignity didn't come from status, but from the way he carried himself when the world offered every reason to fall. Even the preacher spoke of him one Sunday, calling him a man who lived by silence, but taught louder than most who preach. The rancher said nothing when he heard, but deep down, he smiled. That evening, as rain finally returned to the valley, the rancher stood in the doorway of his home, feeling the first drops touch his weathered skin. His sons stood beside him, watching as the land darkened with life once more. And though he didn't speak it aloud, he felt a quiet gratitude, not only for the rain but for the lesson that had brought him here. Respect, he had learned, was not something others could give. It was something a man earned each time he chose honor over pride. The rain did not last long, but it was enough to awaken the land, and something deeper within the people who lived upon it. The valley that had once been divided by pride now shared a fragile unity, born not from words, but from the quiet example of one man. The rancher became a symbol, not because he sought recognition, but because he embodied what the Old West admired most: resilience wrapped in humility. The same men who once mocked him now came seeking his advice, not as a gesture of pity, but as a sign of respect. Yet the rancher never let pride take root again. He remembered too well the sting of humiliation, the weight of shame, and the voice of the Comanche that had pulled him back from despair. Each time he looked to the horizon, he felt that presence still, an invisible reminder that strength is not measured by power, but by how one treats others when given the chance to stand above them. And though the Comanche was far away, his spirit lingered like the echo of thunder long after the storm had passed. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, the rancher's eldest son approached him. "Pa," he said softly, "why did the Comanche defend you that night?" "He didn't know you." The old man paused, his weathered eyes fixed on the distance. "He didn't defend me," he said finally. "He defended what's right." The boy nodded slowly, the words sinking deep. For the first time, he understood that the Comanche hadn't stood up for one man, but for something greater, the bond between those who endure. As summer wore on, The ranch began to flourish again. The cattle grew strong, the fields turned green, and laughter returned to the house. But it wasn't the kind of laughter that came from arrogance or excess. It was simple, honest, born from peace rather than pride. The sons had learned that humility was not weakness, and strength did not need to shout. They had watched their father rise from humiliation, not through revenge, but through grace, and in that, they saw what it truly meant to be a man of the West. But the rancher never forgot the night of the feast, nor the giant who had walked out of the shadows to restore his dignity. That moment had shaped him forever. Sometimes, when the wind swept low through the canyons, he imagined he could still hear the echo of that deep voice, steady, unbroken, like a prayer carried by the land itself. And he knew, somewhere beyond the desert, the Comanche still rode, upholding the same unspoken code that bound men like them. Honor without witness, respect without demand. The following winter came hard and cold. The plains froze under the weight of snow, and even the toughest men felt the season's bite. Yet the ranch stood firm, its people held together by the lessons hardship had already taught them. One morning, as the first frost began to thaw, a lone rider appeared at the edge of the property. The rancher knew that silhouette long before the man drew near. It was the Comanche. He rode slower now, older, his hair streaked with gray, but his presence carried the same quiet power as before. The sons came out to meet him, all written across their faces. The rancher stepped forward, and the two men clasped hands. No greeting, no speech, just a firm grip and a nod. For men like them, that was enough. After a moment, the Comanche spoke. "I came to see if the fire still burns," he said. The rancher smiled faintly. "Still burns," he answered. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of years, of battles fought not with guns, but with the soul. They shared a meal by the hearth that evening. The sons listened in silence as the Comanche spoke of the changing West, of new men arriving with machines and greed, of the land growing smaller as the world grew louder. "The old ways are fading," he said. "Men forget what made them strong." The rancher nodded, the firelight flickering across his face. "Maybe," he said quietly, "but not all men forget." There was conviction in his tone, and the Comanche saw in him the same strength that had drawn him to defend him years ago. When dawn came, the Comanche prepared to leave. Before he mounted his horse, he placed a hand on the rancher's shoulder. "You keep the fire," he said. "There'll be others who'll need its light." The rancher nodded, his throat tight. He wanted to thank him, to say more, but the words stayed where they belonged, in silence. Some gratitude, he knew, was too sacred to speak aloud. As the Comanche rode away, his figure disappearing into the white horizon, the rancher's sons stood beside their father, their breath clouding in the cold air. "Pa," the youngest whispered, "do you think we'll see him again?" The old man watched the trail vanish into the distance and said softly, "No, but we'll feel him every time we do what's right." And with that, he turned toward the rising sun, his heart full, not of sorrow, but of the quiet pride that only true respect can bring. The spring thaw came slowly, melting the frost and breathing new life into the valley once again. The rancher's sons worked the land with a renewed sense of purpose, each stroke of the plow echoing the lessons their father and the Comanche had left behind. They no longer sought riches or recognition. Their pride now rested in the steadiness of their labor and the dignity of their silence. The town, once filled with arrogance and gossip, had begun to change too. Men spoke more carefully, listened more often, and measured strength by action rather than noise. The rancher's quiet influence had reshaped the land more deeply than any storm ever could. As for the rancher, the years had begun to weigh on him. His hair had turned white as prairie snow, and his steps grew slower, but his eyes still held that unshakable calm. The same look he'd had on the night of the wedding feast, when the world had tried to strip him of his worth and failed. The fire the Comanche had spoken of still burned within him, steady as ever, lighting the path for those who came after. He knew that legacy wasn't built from what a man said, but from what others remembered long after he'd gone silent. One evening, he sat on the porch, watching the horizon blaze with the orange light of sunset. His eldest son joined him, resting a cup of coffee beside his chair. Pa, he said softly, sometimes I think the world's changing too fast. Men don't live by the same rules anymore. The old man nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving the horizon. Then we hold to what doesn't change, he said. Respect, work, honor. Those things don't belong to time. His voice was quiet, but each word carried the weight of truth carved into the bones of the West itself. The boy was silent for a moment, taking in his father's words. Then he asked, "Do you ever think about that night? The feast?" The rancher's eyes softened. "Every man's got a night he'd rather forget," he said. "But sometimes, that's the night that saves him." The son nodded, understanding. That single moment of shame had become the turning point in their lives, the spark that had ignited generations of integrity. What had once been humiliation had turned into heritage. As darkness fell, the stars emerged, vast and bright. The rancher leaned back, feeling the cool air brush his face. He thought of the Comanche and the countless miles that stretched between them now. Somewhere, he imagined, that giant still rode beneath the same stars, carrying the same fire. And though their paths had long diverged, the code they shared, the code of men who stood for what was right, no matter the cost, would live on. Because in the Old West, true men didn't need to be remembered by monuments. The land itself remembered them. Years passed, and the old rancher's story became legend. Travelers who rode through the valley still spoke of him. The man who was shamed at a wedding feast and defended by a warrior of another world. They told it differently each time. Some said the Comanche had appeared like a spirit. Others swore the rancher himself had become a guardian of the land. But no matter how the tale changed, its heart remained the same. It was about dignity restored, about the kind of respect that cannot be bought or broken. The sons, now men with gray in their hair, kept the ranch alive in their father's honor. They taught their own children the same lessons, never to measure a man by his clothes, his gold, or his land, but by the steadiness of his soul. And when the children asked about the Comanche, the eldest would smile and point to the horizon. "He's out there still," he'd say, "where the wind carries the truth." The young ones would listen wide-eyed, imagining a giant figure on horseback, a shadow watching over the plains. One night, as the wind swept through the valley with the scent of rain, the eldest son dreamed of the feast again. He saw his father sitting at that long table, the laughter ringing cruelly in his ears, and then he saw the Comanche rising from the shadows, just as he had years before. But this time, when the warrior spoke, his voice seemed to echo from everywhere at once. "A man's worth," he said again, "is not what he owns. It's what he stands through." When the son awoke, those words still burned in his chest. The next morning, he went to the barn and found the feather, the same one the Comanche had left with their father decades ago, still hanging by the door. It had faded with time, worn thin by wind and dust, but it was still there. He touched it gently, feeling its fragile strength, and understood what it meant. The feather wasn't a relic of the past. It was a reminder of how to live, to endure, to stand, to carry the fire, just as his father had, and just as the Comanche once had before him. That evening, as the sun set behind the ridge, the family gathered on the porch. The valley glowed golden one last time, before surrendering to night. The eldest son looked toward the fading light and whispered softly, "He still rides." His brothers nodded, and the youngest smiled. And though none of them could see it, they all felt it, the presence of that giant spirit moving across the plains, keeping watch over the land, over the ranch, and over the fire that still burned in the hearts of those who remembered what it meant to stand tall, even when shamed. Time carried the story of the rancher and the Comanche farther than either man could have imagined. It drifted beyond the valley, through the canyons, over the plains, spoken by travelers who never knew their names but felt the truth in their tale. The Old West, though changing, still needed such stories. They reminded men that honor didn't die when the world grew cruel. It simply moved to quieter hearts, waiting to be remembered. And in that small valley, where once a man had been mocked before a crowd, the descendants of those who laughed now spoke his name with reverence. The ranch itself became a living monument to endurance. The fences stood stronger, the fields richer, and the family that had built it learned to live not for recognition, but for legacy. Each new generation grew up hearing of that night, the wedding feast where a proud man was shamed, and a stranger from another world rose to defend his dignity. The story was not told as legend, but as guidance, a reminder that strength doesn't come from dominance, but from decency. The children learned that true respect isn't demanded. It's earned quietly, in moments when no one else is watching. One evening, many years later, the eldest son, now an old man himself, sat with his grandchildren by the fire. The crackle would fill the air, and the smell of smoke hung thick. "Your great-grandfather," he began, "wasn't a hero in the way stories make heroes. He was a man who fell, but didn't stay down. And when others mocked him, he found his worth not through fighting back, but by standing tall." The children listened, eyes wide, as flames flickered in their reflections. "And the man who stood for him," the old man continued softly, "wasn't his kin, nor his friend. But he knew honor when he saw it, and that was enough." The youngest child, no older than 7, asked, "Do you think they ever met again?" The old man smiled faintly, staring into the embers. "In this land," he said, "men like them never truly part. The wind carries them. The dust remembers their steps." The children fell silent, and for a moment, the room seemed filled with something unseen, an echo, a warmth, as though the fire itself listened. Outside, the night stretched wide and endless, holding their story somewhere between the stars and the earth. That night, as the old man closed his eyes, he dreamed of the valley as it had once been, the long tables, the laughter, the shame, and then the silence that fell when the Comanche rose. He dreamed of his father standing tall beside that giant figure, both men framed by the glow of the fire and the endless sky. When he woke at dawn, the dream felt more real than the years that had passed. He stepped outside and watched the first light touch the land, whispering a single word to the wind: "Thank you." The rancher's family lived on, but as the decades passed, the West itself began to fade. Steel rails cut through the open plains, towns turned to cities, and the old ways gave way to noise and progress. Yet in that small valley, the story of one man's humiliation and another's defense never died. It became a quiet legend, passed from father to son, mother to child, preacher to stranger, because it wasn't just about the past. It was about something eternal, the power of standing for what's right, even when the world looks away. A century after the feast, a traveler rode through the valley, stopping by what remained of the ranch. The fences had weathered, the barns had grayed, but the spirit of the place still lingered. He found an old carving near the corral, a simple feather etched into the wood, faded but unmistakable. Beneath it were words worn smooth by time: "A man's worth is what he stands through." The traveler paused, tracing the carving with his fingers, feeling a chill of reverence in the air. Though the names were long forgotten, the message was not. He asked around in town, but few could tell him the full story. Only an elderly woman remembered the fragments. "They say a warrior once stood for a rancher when no one else would," she said, "and that the rancher spent the rest of his life proving that one act right." The traveler nodded, silent. That night, as he camped by the edge of the property, he felt the wind stir softly through the grass. It carried no sound, but something deeper, something like a heartbeat that belonged to the land itself. As the stars rose, the traveler thought he saw a shadow moving along the ridge. 2 riders, side by side, one tall as the horizon, the other steady and silent. He blinked, and they were gone. Yet the feeling remained. Some stories, he realized, don't belong to time. They belong to the ground, to the wind, to the memory of the land that bore them. And the story of the rancher and the Comanche, of shame turned to honor, was one of them. When the traveler rode away at dawn, he looked back once more. The light caught the old carving, and for a moment, the feathers seemed to glow. He smiled and tipped his hat. "You stood through it," he whispered, as though speaking to ghosts. Then he rode on, leaving the valley behind, but carrying its lesson within him. A truth as timeless as the West itself, that respect earned in silence will always outlast the noise of pride. In the end, the story of the struggling rancher and the giant Comanche was never just about a single night of humiliation or a single act of defense. It was about the timeless bond between dignity and courage. It was about how one moment of honor, born in the silence of the plains, can outlive the men who first carried it. The rancher's shame turned to strength, his pain to purpose, and the respect that the Comanche showed him became a flame passed from one generation to the next, a reminder that real power lies not in pride, but in principle. What began as a moment of ridicule at a wedding feast became a legend of redemption. It taught that in a world quick to mock what it doesn't understand, a single voice, steady, calm, and true, can silence cruelty itself. The Comanche's defense of a man the world had dismissed was more than an act of compassion. It was a declaration that worth cannot be measured by wealth or status, but by endurance. And through that simple truth, both men became immortal, not through fame, but through the lessons they left behind. The rancher's descendants carried that truth quietly, not as a story of glory, but as a way of life. They learned that every man faces his own feast, his own moment of trial when others laugh, when the world turns cold, and that in those moments, what defines you is not the insult, but how you rise beyond it. His silence became the song of generations, reminding all who heard it that forgiveness is not surrender, and humility is not weakness. It is the highest form of strength. And as the years passed, the legend only deepened. For some, it was just a tale of the Old West. But for those who listened with their hearts, it was a mirror. Because the truth is, every one of us has a part of the rancher within, the part that endures, that holds its ground when the world turns away. And somewhere, perhaps unseen, there's always a Comanche, a reminder that goodness, even when rare, still rides the plains of this world. If this story spoke to you, let its silence linger for a moment before you move on. Think about the people who have stood for you when no one else would, and the ones you might stand for now. Share what this tale made you feel in the comments, and keep its fire alive. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, stories that don't just tell, but remind us what it means to be human. Because just like the rancher and the Comanche, some lessons should never fade with the sunset.